the actual things these products technically enable are fantastic. But the problem is, like, sometimes called this MarTech's law, that, technology changes kind of at an exponential rate, right? Moore's laws,
Moore's
example
law.
that.
Yeah.
But humans and organizations, we change probably more in a logarithmic rate. And so what we've had is this 10-year period of this incredible rapid rise of the technology. But even for the most well-intentioned, and strategically oriented, organizations, trying to just keep up with that pace of change, there's just a gap.
Welcome to What If, So What, the podcast where we explore what's possible with digital and discover how to make it real in your business. I'm your host, Jim Hertzfeld, and we get shit done by asking digital leaders the right questions. What if, so what, and most importantly, now what? Hey everyone, I'm excited to have Scott Brinker on the podcast. He's the VP of Platform Ecosystems at HubSpot, and he's the editor of chiefmartech.com, which I would call a pioneering blog that you've been running since 2008. That's a long time, Scott, but tell us how you got here, what you're doing, what you're working on.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Jim. Yeah, I'd say I've always sort of had two parallel paths, what I actually do for a living. So for many years, I was running a MarTech startup myself, a company called Ion Interactive, built a platform for interactive content. Before that, I was running an agency, web development agency back in the days when we remember web development agencies, and then sort of after I built Ion and it was acquired, I then joined HubSpot as their VP of Platform Ecosystem, which is really the mission about helping HubSpot move from being, what was a great product company to really trying to be more of a true platform where it wasn't just what our teams built, but integrations and apps built by, what was now over 1,700 other different companies. But while I've been doing that is sort of the way I earn my living, in this space. Yeah, for 17 years here now, I've been running this Chief MarTech blog, really trying to just look at that intersection of how the worlds of marketing and technology have fused. 20 years ago or so, if you'd gone to a high school guidance counselor, right? Technology would have been one end on the spectrum. Marketing would have been on the exact opposite.
Right.
And having those two things collide and entangle, such a fascinating way in which it's changing the nature of marketing and how we do it and who does it. And so, that's kept me, that is my passion project, for the past 17 years.
We're excited to talk about it. I think, we have a few questions for you, Scott, as you know, that are kind of along those lines, and glad to see it going. Glad to see a blog going this long. And I was kind of actually going back into blog history, and I was thinking, when did I become aware of blogs? And, you're one of the earlier blogs, I'll say. So glad to keep it going. It's definitely a topic that continues to evolve a lot, over the last couple of decades. And to the point where I think sometimes it's even hard to tell where MarTech begins and ends. We've been having a lot of debates within Proficient about what's MarTech and what's commerce and what's a DXP, a digital experience platform. And we actually, some of these debates I had to kind of, throw some cold water on the fire because it was getting heated. So it's kind of a foundational question. Today, how do you define MarTech?
Boy, there's so much loaded in that question.
I know.
I would say, it's funny. I've always taken a very broad definition of it, which is to basically say MarTech is any technology that marketers use to get their job done. And so that to me, it always included we've maintained over, oh my goodness, 13 years here, this MarTech landscape, trying to map out all these different tools, which is a total beast, but we always had included even things adjacent sales tech, that marketers end up working with sales components for, or even things like project management software that marketers use to actually run. It's not that project management software was designed specifically for marketers, but marketers use it. They rely on it, for how they operate. So I would say that's a very broad interpretation, the wide angle view of, what MarTech could be.
So the question is kind of what are marketers doing? Because I think, these days, because there's a lot, I think one of the things I talk to a lot of marketers, there's a lot that they're asked to do, right? There's brand oriented things and sales oriented things, and even some service and, I would say retention and loyalty. There's just a lot. And they have a lot of channels, technical and digital channels that they have to get to know. So they have to be experts in a CMS, and then they have to be an expert in email marketing, and they have to be an expert in what's the latest with LinkedIn and Gen AI. So that role, maybe that's why we're struggling, is maybe the role of marketing is really what's changing.
Yeah. Well, I think you put your finger on it. Every profession has changed, over the past 20 years. And I think everyone sort of feels, the pace of change has been accelerating. But boy, I'd be hard pressed. I don't think I'm just biased on this. I would be hard pressed to find another profession that has had to go as much change and scope creep as marketing has. I mean, you just look over all these changes, even just over the past decade, all these different channels, how things evolve with the web, and we've got our mobile stuff. And now we've got all these technologies on how we're orchestrating this behind the scenes. And, what we're doing supporting, well, it's not just sales, but how does this connect across customer service and product-led growth and digital behavior? And it's amazing. I mean, again, it sort of makes me feel like, marketing really, oh, right. And this is the other thing. I'm like rambling off on all these technology changes, but it's not like the core things that marketing was responsible for, like, went away. I mean, even like the classic, like the 4 Ps and, who's really understanding the market and, driving our narrative and like all that is like, they still had all those responsibilities, just kept adding things on top of that. And so I have enormous respect for, just the breadth of things that marketers as a whole are expected to have familiarity with, if not actual expertise.
So you're making a lot of friends with marketers right now, Scott. So because I think, it is. It's a lot. I think you're right. A lot of things have changed. A lot of things have been additive in a lot of roles. And I think the other thing we talk about a lot here, again, is these definitions change. And again, like, where does commerce begin and MarTech end? And I got another philosophy, maybe who cares, right? Maybe it doesn't matter because, we really have to kind of break down the role. Like, let's start with what are we trying to do functionally, right? What does the business really need? Some of it sometimes I think is certainly muddied by the vendor landscape, and I don't mean to just, disparage any technology companies, but there's a lot out there. You said it's a huge landscape and it's a big machine and there's a lot moving and there's a lot of promise and, a lot of hype, but it's a lot to keep up with. But, a few years ago, I think, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, when we saw some consolidation, we saw some bigger players, kind of entering into this space. I would put Adobe, Oracle, Salesforce in that category. They were starting to buy up small boutiques, smaller niche MarTech companies and growing these suites. They're become very complicated. I mean, we have whole practices dedicated to just, one product or one cloud, in one technology space. So is this still going on? Do you see this kind of just continuing, this sort of consumption, this consolidation on the vendor side? Is that something we're continuing to see?
One of the things that's always made this challenging, because like year over year, that MarTech landscape graphic, that I curate, which started, in 2011 with 150 technologies that at the time seemed like, oh my God, 150, like, how will we ever keep track of them all? Surely that's going to radically consolidate.
That's a big spreadsheet.
And it went the exact opposite direction. It literally had exponential growth year over year for a while. And then it's now over like 14,000. And we don't even have all of them, like,
Yeah.
And so I think people look at that and they're like, well, wait a second, like, isn't this thing consolidating? Because we hear about all these acquisitions, and these top public companies. And what makes the space complicated is both things are true. Consolidation absolutely does happen. I mean, like, if you took that MarTech landscape and instead of just looking at it as a massive sea of like random logos, which very unhelpful, I apologize. But if instead you like ranked it, of like, by size of revenue or, number of customers or size of market share, it would be what they call a long tail. You'd have a very small number of companies that have the majority, of the revenue and the customers. And it's maybe a little bit of like a torso, maybe with a few hundred companies that are really the leaders in different particular categories. And then you have this crazy long tail of just thousands and thousands of companies.
Yeah.
And they each have a role to play. I think the changes that have happened in software where just the barriers to entry of people creating things, have been dropping steadily for, the past decade, 2 decades.
Right.
And now with some of these AI tools, like, oh my goodness, it's like continuing to just like lower those barriers. So you have a lot of that, but there's still so much value to the companies that at the head of that tail because having a whole bunch of disconnected pieces of technology, right, it doesn't work. What you kind of want in many ways is often the best of both worlds. It's like we want these like stable platforms that are the center, of our stack. We use these, to orchestrate, and they often contain a ton of their own capabilities. And, we use what we do there. The simplest stack is best. But then as we want to augment those capabilities with more specialized tools, it's increasingly like the key to that is making sure like, okay, if I am going to bring in a specialized tool to do X, will it integrate with the platform that I have at the center of my stack? Because if it isn't going to integrate, frankly, it's more of a headache than a help.
And Scott, is that sort of your architectural as an architect? Is that sort of your philosophy? Is that sort of driving at HubSpot as well? Just sort of this extensibility? Is that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so this is part of what got me the job at HubSpot is because, I was an independent ISV. I was one of those companies in the long tail. Yeah. And this was a challenge we saw with, our customers. I was maintaining that MarTech map, and you're seeing more and more of the, specialist companies come up is, it's just very clear that, okay, in order for this to work, these things have to integrate around a platform. And what was interesting at the time was a lot of the major players, that you mentioned, they actually weren't looking at it as an ecosystem. They were looking at it as like, we're either going to build or buy what you need. And like, you can just get everything from us. Our suite will to do everything you need. And for a long time, like that really was the strategy they were executing against. And one of the things that I was excited to join HubSpot was the founders there actually felt the opposite. They sort of looked at that and felt like, well, instead of trying to like just ignore or compete or, somehow like FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, all these other things, like what if you could find a way to, harness some of that entrepreneurial energy and help be a platform that, again, like, there's always competitive overlap with different things in this category, but to allow these specialist tools to, integrate to a platform was and that's why I joined HubSpot, was they're like, hey, would you like to help make that happen? I'm like, yes, you had me at hello. And I think you've now seen that across the MarTech industry. Most of the companies have recognized like, okay, we're going to have a lot in our core platform and suite, but we need to be able to be open and integrate with everything else that's out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think to me, it kind of goes back to what is marketing, and kind of leads to my next question, because, we're seeing MarTech being deployed in, I would call sort of post-purchase use cases and experiences and operations, right? So servicing and contact center, long after the sale and long after the marketing team has sort of done their job. And here's MarTech still working to keep the customer, to service that customer. We did some research last year where we saw a big shift from moving from customer acquisition to customer retention post-purchase. Are you seeing the same thing? Do you think that MarTech is sort of being unlocked or redirected away from, let's say, traditional marketing and acquisition and into retention, loyalty, post-purchase types of use cases?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of marketing technology is very horizontal, right? It's like, okay, data profiles of customers. It's how do we think about, automation of, triggers and sequences? How do we think about like the right channels and sort of the content we want to deliver it? And so you can apply that in a number of different scenarios. And there was, I think you're right. There's, it's not so much in MarTech, so much as in marketing, we kind of go through these cycles of, okay, where's the emphasis? What is the business most expecting out of the marketing department? And I think hard to generalize, but, for a while, so much of the focus was on the demand generation and the net new customer acquisition, partly because, so many of these channels for customer acquisition were like that new, the law of experimentation, so it makes sense. But at some point in time, a lot of those channels became saturated, the environment in a number of different categories started to shift where, winning new customers is becoming harder and harder. And this recognition of like, okay, the value with our existing customers and making sure that they don't, churn or that they continue to like grow with us. Yeah. I mean, the math was just very compelling. And so, I think you've both seen a lot of people take those horizontal, MarTech tools and start to apply them to those use cases. But again, we were talking about the big, crazy long tail of all things MarTech. There's a whole bunch of like specialized tools just focusing on things around, customer success and loyalty. And, those are really helpful too.
Yeah. Is there an area of MarTech you see is sort of heating up? Like, is there kind of a what's around the corner? We've got a lot of inquiry around CDPs, customer data platforms. Doesn't seem to be, I don't know what the right word is, sort of stabilizing or norming out. So we feel like that's still pretty hot. Is there anything just from one of those categories, MarTech categories or subcategories, you think is heating up?
Yeah, this is all, I often get asked that question when we publish, our landscape each year. And it's always a bit of a conundrum for me because truthfully, when we like go through year over year and we look at, where are new companies arriving, like where's the churn, where's the innovation, it spreads almost across every category. And part of it just because there's so much competition in every single one of these, categories that for marketers, I don't know, all these companies, it's almost like the classic thing of, capitalism is, yes, it's incredibly hard dealing with that much choice. On the other hand, one benefit you get as a marketer, as a buyer, is having all those companies competing with each other, like the speed of innovation, that happens there, increasingly the leverage that, buyers have is a good thing. So you get the two-edged sword. But I'd say if I was going to pick one thing that I think it's not so much category, kind of is, but it's something that's impacting the entire landscape. I really do think it's a shift in what's happening at the data layer. And CDPs are one example of that. And one of the reasons CDPs, I think, are a bit challenged is, all right, we started with a mode where every MarTech product kind of had its own database in a silo. And this became problematic as the number of MarTech products, the number of data silos started to proliferate. And then the CDPs, they were initially conceived of as like, oh, what we really want is some sort of Switzerland, that can sit in the center of that stack and they can pull the data from all these other different apps and you can organize it and package it and then push it out and activate it. Great concept, which is why the CDP space, I think grew and got on so quickly. But what's been happening is at the same time, these things about broader data infrastructure inside companies around cloud data warehouses and cloud data lakes, things like Snowflake and Databricks, have really started to grow, not just within marketing, but across the organization as a whole.
For sure.
And so you've started to see more and more marketing technology companies that now integrate their data directly to the cloud data warehouse, where they can pull data directly from the cloud data warehouse. And the fact that it's not just limited to marketing, this is a data layer that's exchanging data for functions across the entire company, I think it's actually one of the areas where CDPs are now wrestling because you're like, oh, do I need a CDP because, or do I just do my cloud data warehouse? And the question isn't completely, a foregone conclusion because although we're getting all the data into the cloud data warehouse, we're breaking down some of the barriers of having data flow in our company. Now we're finding the other problem, which is I'm starting to get all the data in one place. Oh, wow, this is a lot of data.
What do I do with it?
Governed and organized, And so there's very well maybe a role of how CDPs evolve that are helping to provide some of that organization and governance on top of that. But in fact, some of them call themselves composable CDPs where they're just keep the data in your cloud data warehouse and, we'll help provide, some orchestration capabilities on top.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I love those kinds of problems because they kind of, they tend to reveal some other problem, I need a CDP or I need a CRM, right? And then you realize, oh my gosh, I have all kinds of other data issues. I have data quality, I have data governance issues. I have data stewardship issues I didn't even know I have. And then those go on to reveal other real business process issues well, wait a minute, none of our sales teams agree on how we should work. So, maybe there's something there. So yeah, I think these are fascinating problems, but you didn't say Gen AI. Thank you.
Because I knew you'd probably throw something at me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's there, right? I think we're in a second wave. I think we're trying to define, there was kind of an initial wave, the initial sort of early, 2023 wave, we're calling it. And there was the reaction. And I think there's a second wave. We're trying to figure out what that is exactly. So I'll tell you right now, we're seeing a huge demand for AI assisted development and product engineering. So you made a comment earlier with some of the Gen AI tools. I could conceive one of those long tail applications this morning and probably have it running and sell and on a marketplace this afternoon, because we're doing a lot of that work. It's true prompt engineering, but through the whole development life cycle. And there's some pretty cool stuff there. But yeah, we're not going to go too deep into that. That's a whole series of podcasts, so we can talk about that. Yeah, just maybe just one more question, and we'll close it out, Scott. I think this is, I hate to use the adage of like sort of keeping us up at night, but sometimes we sense there's a little bit of digital fatigue, and I think some of it comes from this. It's overwhelming, right? It's this overwhelming number of the burden of choice, and that you kind of allude to. But again, there are a lot of hype. There's a lot of promises. There was a lot of spending. I think disappointing utilization. We made these big investments in platforms and we utilize 10% of it. And it kind of goes back to the old adage, one of my favorites, half of my marketing is working. I just don't know which half, so maybe half of my MarTech is paying off. I don't know which half it is. So again, when customers are kind of thinking about this next investment, like, how would you advise them, or what would you, if you were going to give them something to think about in that next investment, how would you sort of guide them to sort of think about getting the best sort of bang for your buck when it comes to MarTech?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is definitely one of the problems that, this space has had here over the past decade is there was, truly revolutionary technology. I mean, like, we even now sort of take for granted things like marketing automation, but the truth is, like, marketing automation was really revolutionary in like the set of capabilities that, allowed us to do. And then we've had nothing but like a whole sequence of, other kinds of innovations and emergences, and the actual things these products technically enable are fantastic. But the problem is, like, sometimes called this MarTech's law, that, technology changes kind of at an exponential rate, right? Moore's law is, an example of that.
Yeah.
But humans and organizations, we change probably more at a logarithmic rate. And so what we've had is this like 10-year period of this incredible rapid rise of the technology. But like, even for the most well-intentioned, and strategically oriented, organizations, trying to just keep up with that pace of change, there's just a gap. And I think there was a case, I don't want to, throw the whole MarTech industry under the bus, but, MarTech vendors are in the business of selling MarTech software. So, they certainly were incentivized to paint the picture of what the technology made possible without necessarily having to worry that much about, like, of course, are going to have like your enablement and training and practice and development. And that's going to take you 5 years before you figure that out. Well, you'll discover that as you go along, and I think that's unfortunate because people have discovered it. But I mean, there isn't a silver bullet to this. It's that, we are having to learn and change how we run marketing, everything from like down in the weeds of, operationally, but also strategically. And how do we organize marketing? How do we run it? How do we collaborate, with the IT team, these are all questions that I think that's like, not just to say one more thing on this, is Avinash Kaushik. I wanted to get his name right. Years ago, I don't know if you know him, or he's like analytics guru for like with Google Analytics and whatnot, years and years ago. I mean, very prolific speaker and writer. And he would always have this thing, I think it became Kaushik's law, where for like, if you have $10, you should invest $1 in the technology and $9 in the people. And I think that's actually the right way to look at this. We need to do more investment in the enablement. And that isn't just things like, formal training, although that certainly doesn't hurt. It's about like even giving people the space to like experiment and to try things, because it's like, it's a very experiential kind of learning. A lot of this is very context dependent, on your business. And I think companies that are willing to make those investments in helping people develop the talent around this technology, that's probably the only path you have through it to saying like, okay, how do we get the utilization and return on this we really expect?
That's a great introduction. I have to sort of shake the cobwebs on that. I think I do know. I think I am familiar with that, but that's great advice. And I think that goes in, that's a whole other topic. Gosh, we can go into is how does anyone sort of adopt any technology, and I'm thinking of like tools I've bought, like hand tools where you have to kind of get out there and start, cutting the wood or, just Just start making it happen, seeing it happen. Like, that's great. There's sort of the space to experiment and really get a hold of it, because I think there's just sort of an inertia, I think, in business, where we set the goal, we make the justification, we got to go out and like achieve that goal, and we're done. And agility, for lack of a better term, requires this multi-skilled flexibility and awareness and all the things. You don't get that until you just start learning it. So that's great advice, Scott. Any final kind of thoughts for the listeners while we have them? Anything that you would, any advice or a next step that you would share today as they move on with their day?
Well, I guess I would say two things, just following up on your observation there is, I almost feel like it's an inverse Lake Wobegon effect, right? Like Lake Wobegon, like all the children are above average. I think, and having spoken to so many marketers and people wrestling with marketing technology, every marketer feels below average in their marketing technology. And you're like, well, wait a second. Okay, that's statistically not true. And I think just sort of the reflection there is you are not as far behind as you probably think relative to peers. There's just so much change that's happening here. I mean, for me, I live and breathe this stuff, and literally every week I'm coming across stuff like, wow, I didn't know that was possible. What is that going to mean? How does this, change these things? And so I think if you recognize it's not you, it's the state of, the world, hopefully you can give yourself a little bit of a pass. But then the question becomes like, okay, well, what do you do about that? And, the only thing you really can do is say like, all right, I can't take all these changes at once, but I can every day or every week be in a position where like, okay, I'm going to push on the curiosity, of trying things. A very specific thing is I follow a fellow named Ethan Mollick, who's a marketing professor, at Wharton. And it's kind of become internet famous here over the past year or so, because he just does a lot of experimentation around these AI tools and then writes about them. And he's just constantly encouraging people to just, hey, listen, don't talk about this stuff. Don't read about this stuff, but playing with this ChatGPT and, or Anthropic or things like that. Not even for the sake of like trying to like turn that into like production impact in your business, but it's like there are some really fundamental changes that are happening with this stuff, and it's hard to truly get your head around it without actually getting hands-on and like playing with it and learning like that. And so anyways, I'm kind of stealing his next best, action of what to do next. But I want to put a big +1 on it. So
I think that's a great theme, around experimentation. I'm inspired here. I ran a weird problem through ChatGPT the other day, and I thought, I didn't, it's the same thing. I didn't know it would respond this way. I was expecting one thing, and it gave me 3 more things. It actually got my problem a little further down the line. The analytics tools, and great. That's great advice. We love something that's actionable. We'll maybe put in the show notes a few of these thoughts, and then a few links. But Scott, thanks for taking the time today. Thanks for joining us. It's a great conversation. We've all been really looking forward to your perspective on some of our questions, and thanks for the blog, and thanks for keeping it up.
Thanks for having me, Jim. Really enjoyed the chat.
Take care, Scott.
You've been listening to What If, So What, a digital strategy podcast from Proficient with Jim Hertzfeld. We want to thank our Proficient colleagues J.D. Norman and Rick Bauer for our music. Subscribe to the podcast and don't miss a single episode. You can find this season along with show notes at proficient.com. Thanks for listening.